This is Capitol View with your host, Jesse Tenor.
Hey, Capitol viewers. This week on the show, I welcomed Senator Tom Cotton. We talked about the Mueller report, the border situation, healthcare, climate change, and a whole lot more. Here's our full, unedited discussion in a Capitol View web exclusive. It's kind of hard to believe, but it's now been 2 weeks since Attorney General William Barr did release his summary of principal findings in the Mueller report. And Barr made sure to say outright no collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, and then no prosecutable obstruction of justice through the course of the probe. So now we're hearing that some of Mueller's team aren't really happy about Barr's summary, and then congressional Democrats are doing everything that they can to shake loose the full unredacted report. So there's, of course, a lot of angles at play here. There's criminal, financial, counterintelligence, and then lots of political posturing, as Trump makes sure to say all along, like he has been, full exoneration, and then Democrats are saying, well, let's pump the brakes a little bit. So I know that you've said you'd like to see a redacted version of the report, and you have expressed concerns about keeping out things like grand jury material. So obviously there's no one solution here that's going to make everybody happy. So what do you see as the next, as the best of,
well, Jesse, it's been 2 weeks since Attorney General Barr released his letter summarizing the principal conclusions of the Mueller report. But let's remember, it's been 3 years that Democrats were accusing the president and his campaign of colluding with Russia. And we now know, in the Mueller report's own words, since Attorney General Barr quoted from it, that there was no collusion between the Trump campaign and its associates or Russia. Now, I hope to see the full report to the fullest extent we can. We do have to recognize, though, that there is classified intelligence sources and methods in there in all likelihood. There's definitely sensitive grand jury material that can't be released under law. Since the Democrats spent 3 years attacking the president, I think it's okay if we take 2 or 3 weeks to ensure that we don't release sensitive or even classified information to the public. And I think the next step is just to evaluate the report that comes to Congress. Attorney General Barr said he wants to have the fullest disclosure possible. If we get a 400-page report that has a few dozen redactions in it, I think everybody will accept that. If we get a 400-page report that has the equivalent of 350 pages blacked out, I think that's a different conversation. We'll have to decide then. But unlike what the Democrats did for the last 3 years, I don't want to jump to conclusions about it.
Okay, and then also moving forward too, some people have brought up the way that James Comey handled the Clinton email investigation in the summer of 2016 by publicly calling her out, even though there was no criminal charge here. So what happens if the report finds that President Trump or his associates, for that matter, acted inappropriately or suspiciously in regards to Russia, but there's no recommendation for criminal charges for Mueller?
Well, first off, James Comey ought not to have done that. That's not the way we operate in the United States. If investigators or prosecutors discover information that puts someone in a bad light but is not a crime, they don't go out and hold a press conference about it. That's one of the reasons why Donald Trump fired him. But second, about the information in the report related to so-called obstruction of justice, I think we can read between the lines a little bit of Attorney General Barr's letter. He says much of that information was already in the public domain. I think we know what he's talking about. He's talking about the president firing Jim Comey and criticizing the Mueller investigation on Twitter and in TV interviews. I think it's pretty far-fetched to say that Donald Trump somehow obstructed justice by tweeting about an investigation into something that didn't happen.
Sure, I guess most people, if guilty, would remain a little more tight-lipped, but that could be argued, I guess, too.
Well, or you could say that, all the behavior on Twitter or in TV interviews in which his opponents were saying he was behaving like a guilty man who wanted to obstruct an investigation, maybe he was behaving like an innocent man who felt unjustly pursued.
All right, yeah. And then last Friday, President Trump went to Southern California to tour the U.S.-Mexico border, of course, and he had been threatening to close the border altogether, which had a lot of people nervous. Now he backed off that. He did give Mexico a year to kind of, work on migration and drugs. So meanwhile, the number of people showing up at the border is rising rapidly as we speak, and then most of these people are crossing between legal ports of entry and turning themselves in, but then you still have border officials say that they're getting overwhelmed here, and then some are, of course, calling on Congress to act. And so what is the right answer here? I mean, the Trump administration has pushed a series of harsh deterrence measures, but are those working in your opinion?
So Jesse, you actually put your finger on part of the problem. We've had a huge surge in illegal immigration at our border. In March alone, it's one of the highest months in the last decade. But it's a very different kind of illegal immigration than most people perceive or are used to over the last 30 years. Most people perceive, and over the last 30 years we have in fact had, mostly younger men who are coming to the country illegally, either to try to get a job or to participate in international criminal rackets. We still have that, of course, but this surge in migration is driven by adults showing up with children, sometimes their own, sometimes not their own, and saying that they have a fear of persecution, seeking asylum, usually from Central American countries. And that child, under our laws and under judicial decisions, basically gives them a get into the U.S. free ticket. So there are things that we can do to immediately stem that crisis, like rapid DNA testing, to ensure that that is in fact their own child, not someone that they just unfortunately paid a human trafficker to help them get into the United States. Building more kind of modular housing so we have more detention facilities at the border so we don't release people into the country, never see them again. Those are kind of immediate actions we can take to try to stem this crisis at the border. Longer term, Congress needs to change our laws. The Attorney General needs to go back to the courts and get those stupid judicial orders overturned or at least modified.
Okay, and then the president's moving money around to get a border wall built. Even in a best case scenario for the administration, could be argued that we're not going to see a wall for years. Assuming that it is built, how do you see it affecting the border situation?
So a border wall is an important part of border security. Any place, especially in urban areas like in California where we built walls, of course they work. They stop illegal immigration. It's not the only solution, though. As you say, a lot of the illegal immigrants we have today are not running away from the Border Patrol, they're running to the Border Patrol. So while a wall is part of the solution at the border, and we should build it everywhere the Border Patrol thinks that we need it, we also need to change our laws. We also need more Border Patrol agents and more immigration judges, so when someone shows up on our border illegally, we can turn them right back around, rather than, again, having to release them into our country, never to hear from them again.
Now, you did bring up Central America, so I know that just this recently, with a rise in violence in countries like Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, the administration did say that it's cutting all direct aid to those three nations. So many migrants being detained at the border are coming from these countries, which are among the most violent on the planet. We all know this, but the president has been frustrated with these governments that they aren't doing more to stop migration. But there are members of both parties who have said that cutting away this aid will just make things worse. So where do you stand on that? Was that the right move?
Well, first off, let me say that conditions in those three countries, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, are pretty dire. Very poor, lots of crime. Those are not grounds for asylum under our asylum laws. We grant asylum to people because they're persecuted because of what they believe or who they are. You know, maybe they're Christians from Syria or Jews from Iran or Muslim Uyghurs from China. We don't welcome into our country people who are the victims of crime or who are coming from poor countries. If we did that, we'd have to welcome in 7 billion people probably from around the world. Those countries need to do a better job, though, of controlling the flow of migrants out of their country at Mexico's southern border to staunch the problem where it begins. A lot of that aid does go to their law enforcement, but unless their law enforcement helps us with the aid that we gave them to staunch the flow of those migrants, I think it's right to relook at the amount of aid that we're giving to them. You know, if we can stop the crisis that we face on our southern border in Central America, then we can refocus on our efforts of helping them build their economy and establish the rule of law and property rights and contract rights and an independent judiciary, the kind of things that will stop both crime or reduce crime in those countries and help them build a stronger economy as well.
This week here in Arkansas, the legislature approved legislation to allow certain immigrants, including DACA recipients, to get in-state tuition at our colleges and universities. And then there was also another piece of legislation to allow DACA nursing students to receive their licenses. Both bills did receive broad support, but of course the debate quickly went to immigration, and then some did say that this should be handled at the federal level.
It should be handled at the federal level, and I've introduced legislation that would both give a legal status to anyone who came to this country as a minor through no fault of their own, as long as we deal with the source of the problem. So if you just award legal status and ultimately citizenship to about 2 million people who came here as minors, all you're going to do is get more people bringing their kids here. I mean, what better reason to try to cross the border illegally than the promise that you might get American citizenship for your child one day? But that's going to creates problems in both encouraging more legal immigration. That's why the legislation I propose would provide funding for the wall and more Border Patrol agents and more immigration judges. It would also allow those people to then get legal status for their family members, to include their parents, the very people who caused the problem in the first place. That's why my legislation would stop extended family chain migration as well. So I think most Arkansans want to address the problem of those who came here as minors through no fault of their own and who have lived here their entire lives. But they also know that if you do that, you've got to control for the negative side effects of it as well.
I wanted to get into another piece of legislation that you're a part of too. So we did see kind of a fairly unusual sight on Capitol Hill this past week when you joined Democrats Chuck Schumer and Sherrod Brown, among others, to introduce a bipartisan bill that would lead to sanctions against China for exporting fentanyl into the U.S. And so are you confident that action taken in the U.S. can correct what's going on in China, or do you fear that this could maybe just ramp up, the relationship with like the trade war that's going on right now?
So we face a true drug epidemic in this country. Over 70,000 overdoses a year. 40,000 of the opioid overdoses come from fentanyl, which is not made from the poppy plant. It's a synthetic opioid that's made in a lot of Chinese super labs, and they intentionally make excess amounts of it. And it often goes to Mexican cartels and comes straight to the United States and kills our citizens. They've been doing it for years. So the legislation I have with Chuck Schumer would crack down on those people in China who are manufacturing and exporting fentanyl into the United States and impose sanctions on them. It would also provide more money for law enforcement and our intelligence services to establish those links. Now, the Chinese government just a few days ago announced that they would stop that fentanyl overproduction. Color me a little skeptical that we can count on the Chinese government to uphold any of its commitments. But if they do, they have no reason to fear our legislation. If they don't, as I fear they might not, which is what their usual habit is with agreements with the United States, then our legislation will hold them accountable for that.
Okay. And then we have seen a lot of developments on health care in the past 2 weeks. The Trump administration says it supports a judge's ruling that strikes down Obamacare altogether. The president is also saying in recent days that he wants to see a new push for health care reform after the 2020 election, when presumably he says Republicans will hold the Senate and the White House and then take back the House as well. So this was a defining issue for a lot of voters in 2018 when the House flipped blue, and it's already becoming a major topic for 2020 candidates. And so what do you think? The politics of this issue are always tricky for both parties. So would you prefer to take up health care now, or do you think the president is right to hold off?
So health care is a critical issue for Arkansans. I hear about it all the time. I think it's fair to say, though, that between Nancy Pelosi's House and Donald Trump, you may not find a lot of common ground. That's, I think, why the president recognizes the political realities in Washington. That doesn't mean that we can't try to make some strides in solving some of the healthcare problems we face or reducing some of the worst harms of Obamacare. I, for instance, worked on the prescription drug issue to try to get more generics on the market so we have more competition for Arkansas seniors so they're paying lower prices. Trying to make sure that drug companies aren't abusing our patent system by extending the life of the monopoly they have, which drives up the price of prescription drugs. In the tax bill, I was responsible for repealing the individual mandate of Obamacare. That's the part that fined 65,000 Arkansans for not being able to afford health insurance. You know, the very health insurance that Obamacare made unaffordable. And who are those people? They're not rich people. I mean, rich people have health insurance. They were working class Arkansans who were paying a fine to their government because they couldn't afford health insurance. That doesn't reform the entire system, but it eliminates some of the worst harms of Obamacare while addressing some of the problems that we can in the interim.
Now, here in Arkansas, too, a federal judge did recently reject the work requirements for our Medicaid expansion program that the Trump administration had approved last year with our waiver. Governor Hutchinson and the GOP state leadership have been pushing for these, saying that they're helping people get needed work skills. But of course, Democrats are really focusing on the thousands who have lost coverage for not complying, including people who are already working. And so do you want to see the work requirements stand? How do you expect all of that to kind of play out?
As a U.S. Senator, my perspective is that is a liberal Obama activist judge who ought not to have struck down the law that our legislators passed. That's ultimately a choice for them. In general, I support work requirements for public assistance, whether it's Medicaid or food stamps or welfare or whatever. That's ultimately a choice for our state legislators, though. But a liberal Obama activist judge in Washington, D.C. ought not have been striking down our law that was well crafted. I hope the state appeals, and I hope they win on appeal.
Okay. Do you see that happening? Because people are seeing it going up all the way to the Supreme Court. Do you think it's stacked to kind of rule in our favor?
So unfortunately,
the governor's favor?
Unfortunately, the Court of Appeals in D.C. was packed by the Democrats back in 2013. You know, we just had a controversy this past week about nominations. This goes back to 2013 when Harry Reid broke the rules to change the rules specifically so they could pack the court in Washington, D.C., which hears so many of the appeals from bureaucratic agencies in Washington. But because the Arkansas law was a novel approach to Medicaid and because it's kind of a test case, I could see it going all the way to the Supreme Court. But I hate to see liberal Obama activist judges striking down laws that our legislature pass that have solid legal basis.
I wanted to ask you about the climate too. So we know that the Democratic Green New Deal proposal is a total non-starter for Republicans. You and many of your colleagues have blasted it, and then the Senate voted it down recently for admittedly, a show vote. The University of Arkansas's annual poll found that in 2018, 46% of Arkansans believe climate change will pose a serious threat to themselves or their way of life during their lifetime. So we have seen your colleague Lamar Alexander, who is retiring, propose a GOP alternative to the Green New Deal. How do you think the issues should be addressed through legislation, and how concerned are you about the effects of climate change?
Well, I'm always amused that bureaucrats and lawyers in Washington think they care more about our environment in Arkansas than our farmers and our ranchers and our foresters and hunters and so forth care about it. We all want to have a clean, healthy environment that's safe for our kids, safe for our businesses, safe for our enjoyment. If you're serious about climate change, there are a few simple approaches that you can take. We could start approving nuclear power plants. They are zero emission and they have a very long life. We could continue to permit on federal lands the production of natural gas, which is the lowest emission carbon fuel that we have. Yet another liberal activist judge just last week struck down a lot of new permits on federal lands. We could invest money not in go-to-market strategies that are not really feasible yet. That's why they need government subsidies like solar panels, but rather in the kind of basic scientific research that would help renewable energy in the long term become viable, like large-scale electricity storage or reversible electrical grid, so you can both generate at your home and with solar panels, but also consume at your home. Those are the kind of basic steps we could do today that would help drive down carbon emissions even further than we have, because America has been leading the world in carbon emission reductions. The Green New Deal, as you say, is just kind of a grab bag of Democratic preferences, but it's also pretty astonishing in its scope and sweep of the infringement it would make on the private economy in the United States and on our individual freedoms.
And then the last time you were on the show, you did announce your re-election bid just recently that week. And so this is the first time, though, that you're running as an incumbent of your the three times that you have been in Congress, first the House and then the Senate. So how do you plan to tackle this re-election bid as an incumbent this time around, when you definitely have more face recognition, name recognition, but then at the same time Democrats are also preparing for a tougher fight?
Well, I'm pretty excited about the re-election. I'm looking forward to the campaign, but I'm also looking forward on the record that we've amassed over the last 2 years, but also that I've amassed over the last 6 years, 2 in the House and 4 in the Senate. In that time, we've had record high unemployment. Wages for working class folks have been going up for the first time. A lot of what I've done has been geared towards that, whether it's trying to cut taxes or repeal that hated mandate of Obamacare, or try to get immigration under control so we don't have low-skilled workers coming in taking jobs or driving down wages. If you look at keeping America safe, I've been on the forefront of rebuilding our military, of withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, of standing by our allies like Israel in the Middle East. So I'm very proud of the accomplishments we have over the last several years, and I'm very looking forward to running on those accomplishments.
And be sure to catch Capitol View on the air Sunday mornings at 8:30 on KARK right before Meet the Press.